for science and research in New Zealand.
I call the Honourable Member David Clendon.
Tēnā koe, Mr Speaker.
Tēnā koe, Mr Clendon.
Sir, I'm pleased to take a final call on this bill, this legislation, which we now will refer to as the Callaghan Innovation Bill, of course. The Greens initially supported this legislation under another name for the very simple reason that we did see a need, a value in establishing some sort of organisation, some entity that could bridge the gap. It could be a networking organisation, a facilitation organisation to inform developments both within science, research and in the business community. There is a crying need for us to better develop, to turn good ideas, good science, good technology into saleable ideas, saleable, ideally weightless commodities or very high value, low volume commodities that can better serve our economy. Unfortunately, we were obliged to turn our backs on that support. We are now in opposition to this legislation. And it's interesting that in my notes I have one of the words used by the former Speaker, our Labour colleague, and that is muddled. And he added the words confused and ad hoc. And unfortunately, that is a fair descriptor of the nature of this legislation. The chair of the Select Committee indicated she did not want that the government's choice was not to make this prescriptive legislation. That's something of an understatement. This is so permissive that the parameters within it are almost meaningless. There are virtually none. This House today will pass this legislation into law with very little idea of the outcome, of the final structure, of the real functions, of the powers and limitations of this new entity. And that's a great shame. It's unfortunate that, in a sense, we think that Sir Paul Callaghan's name is attached to this entity, because organisations whose genesis is confused, is muddled, is ad hoc, is unlikely to be the success that name deserves, I would say. So this bill was rushed through, and indeed the process, the very flawed process, is part of the reason that we are opposing this legislation. Not all of it. The key to it is the content, what's contained within it. But the process was inexcusable. 2 or 3 days after the bill was introduced, we had our first reading. 6 weeks report back date from that first reading, which was the first week of November, the 6th, I think. Less than 4 weeks later, we're now seeing the third reading of this bill. And there are still so many unanswered questions, so much we simply do not know, so much that is left to ministerial discretion, that it's a misuse of the power of this Parliament to bring a piece of legislation like this to the House. There were not a large number of submissions to this bill. Those that did come in were remarkably well informed and coherent, given how little time there was for those people, those organisations, to prepare those submissions. It's fair to say that most of them were supportive, but it was very, very qualified support. Almost without exception, those who were supporting the legislation proposed amendments, proposed or highlighted shortcomings, difficulties, potential problems in the bill, and they were spot on the mark, and very few of those concerns have been met. It's unfortunate the government accepted virtually none of the amendments put in the committee stage of this bill. The committee in itself was able to put in some somewhat better provisions, but overall it is still so permissive, so unconstrained. The Minister will have such extraordinary power to direct the future of the relationship between business and science and the academic community that it is almost doomed to fail in its present form. As I've made the point before, this new entity will almost certainly disrupt and set back some very positive and productive relationships that have already been established. EDANS, the umbrella body for the economic development agencies around the country, put a very good submission where they highlighted the danger of the very good work being done by organisations like EDANS and others that is likely to be stepped back because this bill is so poorly thought through, so poorly drafted. Inevitably, almost, this organisation will come in over the top and undo some of the good work that's been done. Edan's pointed out that the economic development agencies are in a unique position to add value, to leverage the money that comes to them through contestable funding, because they can apply to it not only the limited resource that they get, but they can add it to their existing resource. It was a very compelling submission made by Edan's, and unfortunately they will be deeply disappointed to see that the existing relationships, the organisations, the work that's been done is nowhere protected within this bill, and in all likelihood the good work will be undone. The deal breaker for the Greens in this bill was that very bland, bald statement in the bill that the ATI, the Callaghan Innovation as it now is, will administer and allocate funding with absolutely no indication, no information about which funding, on what grounds. We are told fairness and transparency will prevail. Well, I have to say that one can very transparently starve critical organisations of funding. One can very fairly make decisions, if you use a fairly loose interpretation of that word. It is an appallingly broad, non-specific provision in the bill, and that critically is one which was highlighted, the danger of of funding being channelled so narrowly was highlighted many of the concerns of the submitters. Despite being described as a networking agency, and despite the Cabinet papers highlighting the fact that it would be a networking agency, nevertheless, this Callaghan Innovation is also going to have a considerable research capacity. Initially, it'll take over IRL as a subsidiary, and in time IRL will be disestablished. You get the classic funder-provider dilemma. Callaghan Innovation, as a provider of science and research, will also be making funding provisions, and that is a very, very unsatisfactory outcome for this. There are major IPENs, the Institute of Engineers, highlighted the necessity, in fact they advocated for this new organisation to not have a research function, that they should instead find the existing providers, facilitate, resource, support, all of those good things that the language of the bill might allow, but almost certainly will not, given the clumsiness of the structuring that's been done. There is a major concern now for some 360, 380 staff at IRL, mostly scientific and technical people, who are in very short supply in this country, and it's a diminishing supply. Those people go into the holiday period looking forward to the new year with considerable trepidation. What is their future? Is it secure? The likelihood is it is not secure. We are likely to lose more talent, which has been the story of science and research in this country for at least the last decade, or indeed the last 15 or so years. The question of the career path for science was referred to by some of the Labor speakers who have already spoken today. I'd suggest the Minister have a good read of last week's NBR, particularly the article from Dr. Jacqueline Roworth, currently at Massey, a very well-respected scientist, a good track record, particularly in agricultural science. She points to the fact that this Minister is talking about supporting more science and more engineering graduates through our universities, rather overlooking the fact that one can fund as many positions as you like, thank you Mr Speaker, but must not overlook that potential science and engineering graduates are not going to go into those fields if they can't see a clear career path. And it's muddled decisions like this one about IRL that will discourage that young talent from going into science as a career. We know that the Minister has decreed that one of our largest universities shall have X number of entrants into science and engineering. The rather quaint response, which I absolutely endorse from the university, quaint in the Minister's eyes, is that they've got this belief in something called academic freedom. The institutions must be allowed to decide how many students they take on and graduate in time. But the key point is there must be a career path, or our science and technology capacity will erode over time, as indeed it has eroded over the last several years, and that's something we need to turn around. This entity could have helped that. Instead, we fear that it will actually have a negative effect on that. Finally, sir, I'd say that having established this entity, this Callaghan Innovation, and I still believe there needs to be another word after that to give it a proper title, Having established this and put the name of one of our most remarkable scientists and one of our most remarkable science communicators, the responsibility now lies with this government to make it work. And I think that'll be a significantly difficult task for them. Thank you, Mr. Speaker.
I call the honourable member Dr. Paul Hutchison.
Thank you, Mr.